It's a great honor to be joined by Eric Kaufmann. I, I hope I pronounced that one right. He is a professor of politics at the Birkbeck College, University of London. How are you today, Eric? Thank you for joining this show.
Great, Sean. Great to be with you. As I was saying, we've got a bit of hot weather here, so it's not quite Vietnam, but we're getting there.
Oh yeah, I've heard of the English heat wave that everyone's talking about. So yeah, I hear that you don't have air conditioning over there, so it must be something. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. It's very unusual here.
Mhm. Yeah.
So,
So I've never been to England, but I hear that there's this joke that English people are not familiar with seeing the sun because the weather is so damp and rainy there. Is it, is it a correct statement of fact?
well, I think you're generally right, but we've had quite an unusual drought and hot summer this year. But yeah, I think that's correct. I'm originally from Canada, from Vancouver, where Vancouver has a similar kind of weather to England, except it rains a bit more in Vancouver and it's a bit more sun as well. But
Mhm.
yeah, overall, I think it's gray a lot of the time. Yeah, especially especially outside of the summer months.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of studying in Canada, and I've had distant relatives
Oh,
going at Vancouver, and it seems to me that it is a favorite spot for Vietnamese Canadians because of the favorable weather. You know, we associate Canada with being
oh,
cold.
really?
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah, I guess compared to the rest of Canada's winter, yeah, Vancouver or the West Coast is milder in the winter. Yeah, it doesn't get the snow and ice.
Hmm.
So yeah, in that sense, you're right.
Yeah. So how come a professor from Canada comes to be teaching at a British university? Is it to escape the cold?
No, no, I actually like the cold, but no, it's sort of uh, I went to Britain for a year to study at the London School of Economics, and then
Hmm.
1 year has turned into over 25 years. It's just one thing leads to another. Finished my PhD here, and then wound up getting a job here, and yeah, so I think that's how life works sometimes. It's just you do one thing at a time, and then pretty soon you're somewhere completely different.
Yeah. So you are no stranger to controversial research into demographics, as indicated by your latest book, which is called White Shift, Populism, Immigration, and the Future of White Majorities. I recently heard your interview with Andrew Sullivan, which you did a while back, where you talk about that same book. So could you give us a brief thesis on what that book is about?
Yeah, so this is really about the rise of populism in politics in the West, particularly since 2014, and trying to explain that rise. And you had basically the book argues that this is about the ethnic shifting that's occurring in Western countries, whereas some other people would put it down to issues around deindustrialization and economic change. And I think the any close studying of survey data shows that that's not really there's very little evidence for that. So the evidence that I looked at a lot of survey data for Europe, United States, and what you see is essentially people who vote for Trump and Brexit are people who care a lot about immigration, or in the US case also issues like identification as being white, for example. These sorts of cultural considerations are really what help to explain who votes for right-wing populists. And this is sort of reflective of the kind of significant ethnic transformations that are occurring in Western countries. The United States, for example, went from about 85% non-Hispanic white in 1960 to around 60% today, and that's something similar is happening in other countries. Canada has gone from maybe 98% white in 1960 to about 75, 76 today. So that kind of scale of change, and then by mid-century, sort of moving into what's called majority minority societies. Now in Western Europe, it's not quite as quick as that, but by the end of the century, it'll have reached this majority minority point. So I'm trying to make this argument that behind these demographic transformations, that is ultimately a major factor behind the rise of national populism. Now, of course, the second part of the book, though, tries to look more long-term and argues that race mixing between white groups and other groups, particularly Asians and Hispanics, but also Black groups, will produce a melting pot, a sort of mixed group that becomes the majority population in the next century. And that will probably be a time when some of these tensions start to become less pronounced. But the point in the book is really that that's not going to happen in a serious way till the end of our century. So during our lifetime, we should be expecting to be living through a period of rising tension over these issues, and politics increasingly will be redefined, on cultural lines. The main divisions in society will be cultural and not the older economic division between communism, capitalism, left versus right. Those economic issues are going to become less important for voting. And you can see it in different ways. So, for example, in Britain, the Labour Party, which was named for the workers, and the Conservative Party have a very similar class composition now. Whereas if you were to go back even to 1997, the Labour Party had a far more working class voter base than the Conservatives. And now actually probably the Conservatives have a somewhat more working class voter base than the Labour Party. That's just an example of where the old class-based, economic-based voting is giving way to voting along lines such as where are you on the issue of immigration, on the issue of Brexit. These sorts of questions are much more cultural, and they link very much more to these ethnic transformations and cultural transformations. And that is really what's driving politics today in the West.
I see. So I'm two questions relating to that. So one, I paid somewhat close attention to both Canadian and UK politics. So for one, in my years of living in Canada, the only sign I see of this, I guess, what you would call a white backlash or a white shift is the founding of a party known as the People's Party of Canada, which by this man, Maxime Bernier, which incidentally, I had him on this same show. So far, he has gained no seats in the Canadian House of Representatives. That has not been so successful, but maybe you have a different view on that. But in the UK, do you see the same sort of like, I guess, white identity politics in the Conservative Party election that's going on?
Well, interesting you mentioned that. I'll come back to Canada in a minute, but right now there's a leadership contest between Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. And what you can see is that, for example, amongst Conservative voters, I just have a piece out today, actually, in Unheard, based on a poll I ran, I think it was yesterday. Conservative voters who want immigration reduced a lot, over 3/4 of them said they preferred Liz Truss to Rishi Sunak. Voters who said they wanted immigration to stay the same or increase were slightly more pro-Sunak. So again, we're starting to see this populist cleavage emerging even in this leadership race, that the more national populist, say immigration restrictionist voters who are concerned about the culture war are gravitating towards Liz Truss and away from Rishi Sunak. Now, it's not actually because Rishi Sunak has an Indian ethnic background. There was a candidate called Kemi Badenoch, who's of Nigerian background, but who was very strong on the culture war and immigration issues, and she was the front-running candidate. It's not so much the actual ethnic background of the candidates as to what their message is on the cultural issues the voters are concerned about. And in this case, Truss simply has a longer record of being stronger on issues around patriotism and the culture war. Even though on immigration, she doesn't really have that record, but I think the sort of vibe that she's projected for the cultural Brexiteers has been a stronger one than Sunak. Sunak is trying to do it, but he's done it too late, and it's not arguably credible enough to cut through with the voters. Now, I mean, in terms of Canada, what I'd say is, I think you're right that the national populists have not made the breakthroughs in Canada that they have in other almost all Western countries. I mean, it's worth saying, however, that if you were to go back to the early 2000s, you only had successful populist parties in a few European countries like Italy, Austria, France. And now you've got these national populists in almost every major Western European country. And in almost every major Western European country, they're running at least 10%. Now, the exceptions are places like Ireland or Iceland. These are countries that have also got very historically low Muslim populations, for example, like Ireland and Iceland. So there is a connection to the rate of ethnic change, the kind of ethnic change that's occurring. Now, you go to Canada. Canada has got some distinction, some differences. The first point is, of course, that in Quebec, I would call the CAQ a national populist party, and it's won in the provincial elections there, and one of its platforms was reducing immigration. So I think Quebec fits the broader pattern very well. It's English Canada, which does not. But I would sort of, so first of all, a couple of things about English Canada. One is, if you look at the support for the Conservatives on the one hand, and then on the other hand, Liberal and NDP, there's almost no switching now between those two parties, very little. The Conservative voters, the polls, essentially surveys that I've seen, show, opposition to the desire to reduce immigration is in the majority amongst Conservative voters, and it's very low amongst Liberal and NDP. The gap between the two parties on immigration is something like 50 points, which is as large as the gap between Republican and Democrat in the United States. So the Canadian case has polarized along these issues the same way that the United States and other Western countries has. The difference is that in Canada, unlike most other Western European countries or Western countries, the left-right balance is more like 60% left, 40% right in Canada, English Canada. In other countries, it's more like 50-50 or even a slight advantage to the Conservatives. There's a whole bunch of historical reasons for that. But what that means is it's very tricky for a populist party to come in, because when the Liberals are in power, the populist voters will be more interested in getting Trudeau out than supporting an alternative to the Conservatives. So because of the electoral mathematics, it mitigates against the rise of a strong populist party alternative. However, what I think we might say is that if the Conservatives get in and don't do anything to address the issues that these voters care about, that whether it'll happen in one cycle or two election cycles, I think there's a lot of upside potential for the People's Party to increase their share of the vote. Because I do think these grievances are there. It's just that the way they map onto the political parties in Canada is a little different.
I see. Right. So time for me to segue into the main topic of today, which is your Quillette article. I have this habit of, ever since starting this show, to read something that is interesting from Quillette and then ask the author to come in, and you happen to be one of them. The article is titled Progressivism, Sexuality, and Mental Illness, which is definitely three very non-controversial topics in our political discourse. But I'd like to begin by asking, since we are discussing identity politics, is it ever a good thing, identity politics, or at least a helpful element of political discourse?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because a lot of people will say identity politics is awful. We should just be individuals. I think that is not realistic from a human evolutionary psychological perspective, right? I think people have identities, but what I think we can do is distinguish between a what Jonathan Haidt calls a common enemy type of identity politics, where you define yourself against somebody else, um, and a common humanity type of identity politics, where, yes, you define yourself on the basis of an identity, but that's just because you take pride in that identity, and it's not about putting down or being superior to somebody else. And in fact, the psychology literature is very clear that for most, say, ethnic groups, attachment to your own group doesn't make you more hostile to an out group. And it's common misperception that it does, but only during wartime or very, strong conflicts over resources do you get the relationship. The more you love your group, the more you hate the other group. So in the US case, for example, if you look at the American National Election Study, people who feel warmer, white Americans who feel warmer towards white people, do not feel cooler towards Black people. If anything, they feel slightly warmer towards Black people. So the point is that you can be attached to your own identity without doing it in a kind of oppositional and conflictual way with other groups. Now, it is the case that if a group, if you are a member of a group that's meaningful to you, you'll probably be attuned to if your group is being discriminated against. I think it's perfectly legitimate to want to fight for your rights. I would say, however, that must be balanced with an appreciation of the whole of society, and not just getting more for my group, but thinking about, well, what about what's good for everybody? And maybe I'm going to go for a little bit less than what I think is perfect, in order to make the whole work well as well. So I think you can kind of have a sort of more intelligent and moderate kind of identity politics, where you do look out for the interests of your group, but at the same time you're also balancing that with an appreciation of the whole, and the idea that everyone has to do a little bit of give and take in order to make the system work, and identification with the wider, whether it be the national identity, whether it be a supranational identity, but something that is a bit higher than just your own narrow group, I think is important. But so I think it's natural and normal to have a group identity, but it needs to be sort of balanced by attachments to higher order principles.
Yes, I would identify myself as a conservative, and I hear a lot of some of my fellow travelers of conservatism, when they say that they dislike identity politics or hate it, well, they themselves practice a kind of identity politics, which is for the most part national. They love the US, Canada, the UK, and all that, and also political. They constantly badmouth the opposition, the Democrats, the progressives, the liberals. I think the way I see it, a kind of identity politics that excludes ressentiment or resentment, the French word, may be one that is helpful to our political discourse. But if you infuse that element of resentment, which it can easily be done, then you end up something looking like Charlottesville or the mass shooter at Buffalo.
Yeah.
So
Oh yeah.
yeah.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, by the way, the partisanship ideology is one of those identities that fits the zero sum type of model. So if you look in the American National Election Study, the more attached you are to the Democrats, the cooler you are to the Republicans, and vice versa. So partisanship and ideology works right now, currently in the United States, in a zero sum way, whereas racial identity does not work that way. Racial identity, the more attached to your group, doesn't make you more hostile to outgroups. But for political identity, in fact, right now we're in that situation.
And of course, this article of yours, it's a report on how, I guess, LGBTQ plus. If you're Canadian, you probably know what two-spirit means. So there's
Right.
numbers as well as letters. This cohort has gradually become a political identity rather than a sexual slash gender identity. I've mentioned Andrew Sullivan before. In his days as a gay rights activist, he authored this book called, was it Virtually Normal? The Politics of Homosexuality. So how would you define or describe the current politics of, I guess, well, we shouldn't be calling it homosexuality in the interest of inclusivity, which should call it LGBTQ plus identity. What do you make of the politics of that group?
Well, I think it's wrapped up in a politics of what I would call cultural socialism, which or what you might think of as a sort of cultural progressivism, which and the way that I would define this ideology is essentially it's about equal outcomes between identity groups as the goal, as well as protection from harm, including psychological harm such as being offended and feeling unsafe, so-called. So these two elements are the core to this ideology of cultural socialism. One dimension of this is, of course, race and racial minorities. Another dimension is gender, feminism. Another dimension is sexuality, sexual orientation, which is where the LGBTQ angle comes in. It's seen as, essentially, it's seen as a natural match between that sort of alternative sexual orientation to the sort of cis heteronormative mainstream. So you're different. It's the ideology of cultural socialism. It places a lot of emphasis on both difference, not sameness, but difference, and also this idea of being against whatever is the dominant, the powerful. So to the extent that this group has a history, and of course it does, of being marginalized, the identification is very much one of being a victim group, fragile group, and therefore being part of a kind of coalition of victimized or fragile, historically marginalized groups. And so I think that's where there's a very strong political coloring to LGBTQ. And if you look at the survey data, people who identify as LGBTQ are far more likely to identify as particularly very liberal on a 5-point scale that would, in the US case, where liberal means left, you have very liberal, slightly liberal, moderate, which is in the center, slightly conservative, very conservative. On that 5-point scale, if you take the first most left-wing part of that scale, there's a very high correlation between identifying as very liberal and identifying as LGBTQ. The other part of this, of course, is that in the young population under age 25, the survey data typically finds sort of 25, even 30% of people identifying as LGBTQ in countries like the US and Britain. Now, methodologically, that number is vastly inflated, but leaving that aside for a minute, so it is a significant chunk of people answering surveys. And what I find essentially is there's a very strong link between people who are who think of themselves as very liberal or very left-wing and LGBT identity. And when we push on that, as we'll probably talk about in a minute, my contention is a lot of this is simple identification as LGBT without actually behaving LGBT. And it's those people who are really politically, I think there's a strong political input to their identification.
Yeah, that I think should be the most controversial part of your report, your research. So this is a pretty cheap example, but maybe just today I read on the news that Demi Lovato recently switched back her pronouns from was it they, them to she, her. And so that example
Right.
alone, that example alone sort of confirmed my suspicion that what we now call today's non-binary identity is almost completely made up. Uh, so there seems to be, again, as your researchers point out, a gap between LGBT identification and LGBT behavior. And so perhaps we can speculate on why these people who are mostly young and perhaps maybe a bit confused um, gravitates towards an identification of LGBTQ without actually behaving that way.
Well, I mean, yeah, the data is very powerful too. I mean, I was looking at a survey of American undergraduate students by the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. They've captured now in two waves about 55,000, so it's absolutely massive sample. And you know what you can see are some interesting trends. For example, again, people who are very much to the left politically as students are much more likely to be LGBT than those who are in the center or on the right. It's something like over twice as likely. Secondly, even within those who identify as being very left wing, the ones who are very activist left wing, so who say that shouting down a speaker who's offensive is a good thing to do. You know, if you agree with that, and you're a very liberal, you have about a 7 in 10 chance of being LGBT, compared to about maybe 4 in 10 chance if you are still very liberal, but you don't agree with the shouting down, or maybe it's 3 in 10. So there's this very strong political input in terms of LGBT identification among American undergraduates. But now, so I think part of this is seen as radical politics, and it's just to identify yourself as straight and heterosexual would be to kind of conform to the bourgeois conservative system. But there's also another aspect to this, which is, I think, to do with something that isn't as explicitly political and is much more about what I would call a kind of cultural modernism, that you are simply cool because you are new and different and divergent, and so you're an original person in a culture that places a lot of emphasis on being divergent and original and different. Saying you are bisexual instead of, say, straight, as a woman in particular, but either, you know, that is kind of almost has a cachet to it, almost gives you a certain distinctiveness. And so even amongst less political groups, such as African American women without university degrees, we can see a significant share identifying as bisexual, let's say, amongst young people. And so I think there are two things going on. I mean, one is this general pop culture, which emphasizes being different and novel and new, and that puts a sort of premium on something like being LGBT. And then on the other hand, you also have a very explicitly political thing. I'm resisting on behalf of the oppressed, historically marginalized. That too adds to it amongst the well-educated and elite segment of society. So I think both of those things together really help explain this big increase. And if you look at the survey data, I think there's been something like a tripling in the share of young people who are identifying as LGBT. It's sort of the Gallup survey data. It goes from about, I don't know, 7 or 8%, if my memory serves me correctly, in 2008 to about 21% in 2021. So we have a sort of tripling and similarly in other data sets. So there's been this big increase over time. And part of what's going on is to explain that increase. One of the things you can do in some American survey series is look at the sexual partners people have had and their gender, and compare the actual sexual partners with the stated identity. And what's fascinating is you can see that amongst particularly female bisexuals, which is the largest group in terms of growth and change. So more women identifying as bisexual is a big factor driving this increase. And actually, if you look at that closely, what you see is the share of female bisexuals who actually have a same-sex partner, have had a same-sex partner in the last 5 years, has dropped from, substantially, from something like 75%, let's say in 2010, to sort of a third or 40%. It's just gone down tremendously. So you've got a lot of these very essentially straight women identifying as bisexual, and increasingly. And so that, I think, just speaks to this trend of this being a cultural movement, a culturally driven peer-to-peer contagion, not quite a copycat movement, but essentially it's about identity. It's not so much about behavior.
So full disclosure, I have a friend living in America who's a musician, and she is identifies as bisexual, and she basically ticks virtually all of the boxes that one would ascribe to a progressive. So I would advise her not to get in, but I think, but when I reached the research that you show regarding bisexual women, I just thought of her. Um, um, but I find that I find that social contagion and the demographic of, say, young middle to upper class girls and women who are white, I must add, it's a really fascinating research because the group that is most affected by eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia, and all that stuff are young, white, middle, and upper class girls. And according to that book by Abigail Schreier, Irreversible Damage, that is also the group that is affected by, I guess, the trans identity. They think of themselves as trans, and I imagine that is must be the same with I guess bisexual identification. So to the best of your knowledge, why young girls who are white of middle and upper class background most affected by these social pathologies?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I didn't test, or maybe I didn't pick up as much the class dimension as the mental illness dimension. So, for example, if you agree with the statement, I feel sad or anxious most of the time or all of the time, you're vastly more likely to be LGBT. Now, the way that the progressives would explain that finding, and let's just put some numbers on this, 75% in 2021 amongst US teens, according to the CDC, right? This is like not some sort of strange set of data. According to the CDC, Center for Disease Control, 75% or slightly above of LGBT Americans aged 15 to 19 are reporting feeling sad or hopeless all or most of the time. 75%, I mean, it's a staggering number. Now, of course, the pandemic played a role. It boosted these numbers across all groups. But if you compare the average to the LGBT number is about 30 points, at least 30 points higher than average. And it's been consistently higher. Now, the standard explanation as well, it's because these people are being discriminated against, or, in some ways it's traumatic to be LGBT. The problem with that explanation is if you were to go back to, 10, 15 years ago, and you look at numbers on LGBT mental illness, they didn't differ as much from the average in the population. At a time, by the way, when there was, no gays in the military, there was no gay marriage, there's all the, there's no question that toleration for homosexuality has risen exponentially since that time. And at the same time, the rates of mental illness have risen in this group exponentially. Now, it simply doesn't compute with the idea that people are not tolerant of LGBT. In fact, what it would suggest is another dynamic, which has been sort of hinted at by a Boston University professor called Leah Greenfeld, who would suggest that when you take young people and you remove boundaries and you multiply choices about identities, you induce a state which is called anomie. That's a word that goes all the way back to Emil Durkheim in the late 19th century. And it's harder for them to construct a secure identity. There are more sort of internal psychological tensions that are produced as a result of removing clear gender roles, let's say, or clear sexual roles. And so one of the other interpretations that, the one that I hinted at, was that this multiplication of options and the lack of clear boundaries and gender roles could well be what's behind this. And there has been, and again, it's very tricky. There was a study recently showed that women who moved from LGBT to heterosexual in surveys experienced a improvement in their mental health, and vice versa. So this is within the same individual moving between identities. They're moving between mental health states. So there is this very strong link between sexual orientation and mental health. It's there repeatedly in every data set. And there's just, you are only really allowed in academia to interpret that in one way, which is that society is excluding, and that puts psychological pressure on LGBT people. But in fact, there's just not a very convincing explanation of this link. And I think actually, if we're really concerned about mental health and this epidemic of mental health problems, particularly amongst particularly young women, but young people in general, then we really would be a lot more serious about looking at these links. You know, when you're talking about 25-30% of young people identifying as LGBT, and that group having 75% of them saying they feel sad or hopeless all the time, you know, that's becoming a major health problem. And it's something that in a normal society, we would be having a lot more research on from a lot more different perspectives to figure out what's going on. It's really not been possible to do that kind of work.
Yes. You know, I've read much of the literature surrounding gender affirming care that I presume that there's a UK clinic called Tavistock, which recently closed its doors. And that is a particularly alarming example for me, because when someone who is young in age declares himself, herself to be of another gender, chances are there are a host of underlying problems that needs to be addressed. But the gender affirming clinics, they would believe the words of this young person at face value, and therefore irreversible damage is done to their bodies. So let's move on to the mental health angle. So it does seem to me that there's a correlation between progressive political views and mental illnesses, the common ones, I guess, depression and anxiety, and even bipolar and such. I've heard this interpretation being, I guess, voiced before, but the idea is that your mental illness is not really because there's something wrong with you. There's something wrong with the society surrounding you, and you know that Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the great U.S. senator, coined this phrase, defining deviancy down, where he says that perhaps when there's so much disorder, the level of disorder rises above a level that society can tolerate. Suddenly, that kind of disorder becomes, well, not disordered. And in the opposite way, what is known as order in the old days become disordered. So in regards to this mental health question, when you think that society is so disordered and so unequal, and so having a negative reaction to it in a form of bad mental health is considered normal, while having a healthy reaction to much of society's ills is considered disordered, because you've shown you've built up a tolerance towards that. So my question to you is that if uh, is that what you've observed in your research as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I'm still sort of chewing it over. I mean, I think there is a link. I mean, this mental health is linked to the nature of society. That's sort of Greenfeld's point, is the more your role in society is given to you at birth, the more your identity is given to you at birth, and there's a clear, set of things you do as you get older, a sort of life script. The sort of more well-defined that is, the less mental illness. The more that is up for grabs and is unclear, the more mental illness. So that's sort of an enemy Durkheimian theory of mental illness. So to the extent society becomes more, as you say, disordered, or identity, everything is up, for grabs. So gender is a choice, sexuality is a choice. All of these things are, you're deconstructing the biological basis of sex. All of these things then introduce more capacity for dissonance into particularly young people who are at that stage where they're trying to find their to a secure and stable identity. And so that, I think, would be the way that a Durkheimian type, which is deeply out of fashion, but that kind of approach would sort of say that, yes, the nature of society that's responsible for the rising epidemic of mental illness among young people. The other thing I would say is, I don't think social media, for example, or certain types of parenting, and some of those things are often linked to increased problems with mental health. I don't think those are really the explanation we see. I mean, one of the interesting comparisons is between advanced East Asian societies, where you are, or advanced Western societies, and you see a much higher incidence of mental illness in the Western societies. So it's not possible, in my view, to say this is about technology. I think it is much more of a cultural issue, to do with just the way Western societies have evolved, both in terms of the expressive individualism and the sort of deconstruction and transgression of boundaries, which is in what's known as cultural modernism on the one hand, and at the same time this idea of leveling hierarchies, which is central to the sort of cultural left project. Both of those two things, I think, have contributed to a certain disorder in the society, and young people, as trying to form a stable identity, are confronting this disorder, and this is, I think, what is behind what we're seeing. And that's just a very hard message, really, for people who, let's face it, in these professions such as psychology, medicine, sociology. I mean, they are, those who practice, particularly academics, are almost entirely on the left. And we've got, data, very clear data on this. I'm not making this up. In terms of the faculty, you're probably talking about, in some cases, such as sociology and anthropology, almost 100-to-1 left to right ratios in the amongst professors in these fields. So you're just not going to get a balanced evaluation there in a particular monoculture, which doesn't really allow for people to go outside the bubble and explore different explanations, right? But I think this is something that's probably going to happen.
Oh yeah. So to continue on to the defining deviancy down, the Moynihan point. So a new term has emerged, neurodiverse. I see it used a lot by people who I went to university with.
Right.
I mean, of course, it's it's a politically correct way of saying that you have, a mental disorder that needs to be looked at. But nevertheless, it does correlate to when two things, the rise in mental illnesses among the young, as well as the fact that people didn't want to, I guess what you call it, stigmatize mental illness. Those two things gave birth to the popularity of the word neurodivergent. Which brings me to how the contradiction between how these people who call themselves neurodivergent and LGBT and vice versa, how they can be so uncertain about their own identity. We often say that the young, they're still figuring out, they're still finding themselves, which is legitimate, but they hold very concrete black and white opinions about the world surrounding them. Obviously, the white majorities or white people are the oppressors, or history of the West is filled with colonial oppression and subjugation of those non-whites. Being conservative is bad, being liberal even is bad, but there's only one good and angelic worldview, which is progressivism. So how would you explain this, I guess, incoherence in one's thinking?
Yeah, and you're right. I think there was a recent study looking at the shift from moral relativism to moral absolutism amongst progressive university students between, let's say, the early 2000s and the mid 2010s. There's been a shift, it's well documented, towards moral absolutism. So what I think is going on is you've got a strange thing going on. On one hand, you have an attempt to say that identities like gender, race are socially constructed and therefore fluid and malleable and a matter of choice. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you have the view that the ideologies, particularly the progressive ones, are not a matter of choice. So, for example, trans, or for example, if we take the idea of structural racism. So these ideas are not seen as social constructs, which of course they are. They're probably more of a social construct than the identity. So, for example, if you were to say, as I did in my Manhattan Institute report, that I argue that racism and white supremacy in America today are largely social constructs of the media that don't really align with any hard measures in any serious way. But you're right that, of course, a lot of young progressive people will just take it as read that there is structural racism and white supremacy, and that's not up for questioning. That trans is not something that's shaped by social contagion, peer influence. So that trans, for example, or structural racism are fixed, given, automatic, unmediated, and not socially constructed, whereas gender and race, for example, are socially constructed. So you've got this strange, and the way it's really interesting to see certain cases like Rachel Dolezal, those who sort of want to go from transgenderism, which is approved of because gender is seen as a social construct. So of course you can move genders. Oh, well, what about transracialism? I can move races and I'm born in the wrong racial body. That is a no-no. And it's very interesting to see that you take exactly the same philosophical principle, which is the blank slate, and you can be anything you want, and everything's a social construct. But all of a sudden, oh no, we better backpedal because actually, in the victimhood pecking order, we've offended a group that's got more victimhood points, and therefore we've got to back off. And so it kind of shows you the hollowness of there are no real consistent philosophical approaches here. It's just whatever's expedient for promoting what I would call cultural socialism, which is essentially where you have groups with a higher number of victim points at the top of the totem pole, and those with the lowest points, which be white males, cis hetero, etc., at the bottom of the totem pole. And it's all about where you are on that pole. And if you are lower on the pole, you just have to defer, bow your head, so even if you have an explanation, like even if you say, well, yeah, you could move gender, you can move race too, that is a violation of the totem pole, which is ultimately what drives this whole system. It's not a rational system; it's a religious system where you are worshiping those with more victimhood points, and so the religion trumps any kind of principle here.
Oh yeah. That's John McWhorter wrote about the same thing, but he focuses on the race question. Um, so as I would like to focus on how the word trauma becomes so popularized and politicized these days, despite the fact that, I would say that there are, of course, there are valid reasons for one to be traumatized, um, but the way I see it, people are there's that word, right? Generational trauma or collective trauma, which people uh, basically appropriate a a form of trauma, real or imagined, from their own social class or ethnic group. Um, and it brings to mind, let me rephrase this question. How uh, well, let's just lost my thoughts there. Excuse me. Um, how there's this desire to appear to be, to be different and non-conformist, and this relates very well to people who are of a more liberal progressive point of view, in that they form their views based on these things which cannot be refuted. Right, there is, I found it. For example, if you say argue with someone about their political views on, Black Lives Matter and such, they would say that, well, I am part of this one oppressed group, i.e., being of Black skin color or being of the LGBTQ or having suffered from collective/generational trauma. Therefore, I have these views, and therefore, if you try to refute it via reason argument, you are, was it, delegitimizing my identity. So I believe that there should be a healthier way of looking of perceiving identity, first of the self, and then of the people whom you share, group associations with, and even later on groups that you don't share associations with. Um, so how would you prescribe such a way to look at yourself in a more healthy manner? Again, I apologize for being long-winded.
Yeah. Well, I think this sort of what's called standpoint epistemology based on lived experience and introspection, I've had certain traumatic experience. I mean, my own take on that is that the trauma is highly socially constructed, to use a progressive kind of term, but I think it's actually, it describes to a large extent what is going on, is that people are choosing to inhabit victim versions of identity, because you could imagine sort of a more resilient and positive version of, say, Black identity, looking at Black achievements in terms of, the fact that they were, if you take Black Americans, they went from slavery to where they were totally illiterate to being very highly literate in a very quick space of time. The innovations in terms of music, the entrepreneurship that existed in Black communities, you could actually construct quite a positive Black identity, and which I think is actually truer to the way many Black Americans actually do identify. They don't identify with this highly politicized oppositional. I mean, they do to some degree, but the highly political oppositional type Black identity is more common amongst university educated African Americans, and particularly activists. And so what I would say is then that this whole process of this whole thing about identity, it's not just given, it's actually something that people have a lot of choice in, and it's a construction, especially because these people haven't themselves been victims of slavery, haven't themselves been victim of segregation. So they have to imagine their way back into that identity and then try and look for signs in the present that they are somehow the victims of racism and discrimination. Now, it's not to say there's no racism, but it's vastly inflated. So what I would say is that essentially this is no basis for constructive dialogue, obviously. I mean, if the way we have dialogue, in the post-Enlightenment period, it's all about measurable, falsifiable, testable, refutable evidence, which must be generalizable. You have to devise social scientific measures and tests like attitude survey scales or something that would then allow others to critique your work, because our own perspectives and identities are so shot through with biases, which psychology, behavioral economics will tell you that, we're constantly, our sort of lizard brain is constantly pushing us in a certain direction, and we're just rationalizing that all. We're not actually seeing ourselves objectively. And so I think this is, again, what I'd say is this whole standpoint of epistemology thing, this idea that it's about my identity, you're traumatizing, erasing, all of that is highly anti-enlightenment, irrational, regressive, and we have to sort of essentially just call it for what it is, which is a sort of ideology. It's just an ideology which is counter-enlightenment and irrational, and it's just no basis for scientific progress. Now, of course, you could sort of certainly mention experiences, but we should be taking those with a much bigger grain of salt, knowing as we do the kind of motivated reasoning and biases that people have, selecting of experience, the role of social and ideological construction in sensitizing people, and making them interpret things in a certain way. The whole thing is just so shot through with bias. So yeah, I guess my solution to all this is just applying a standard Enlightenment framework that would say, sorry, we all play by the same rules. We just like we speak the same language, we have to speak the same scientific language, which means you've got to present your arguments in a way that's generalizable, measurable, testable, falsifiable, or else we're not going to take you seriously. I think that's the only way to really move forward on this.
Yeah, couldn't have put it better myself. So final question. What is there a book you would recommend to anyone who's caught up with this progressive ideology that is, either suffering from mental health issues or are identifying as LGBT without matching that via behavior? Yeah, what would be a book that you would recommend to them?
Yeah, it's a really tough one because I don't think that's necessarily been written. That book has been written. I mean, there are books that will help you to understand the ideology that is driving this. I mean, if you go back, there's a book called The Dark Side of the Left, which I think is quite interesting. Just looks historically, going back at all a whole range of different left-wing movements, some of them more cultural, some more economic, and shows how they went off the rails and tipped over into an extreme. It's important to understand utopian extremism, to understand what's happening now, that there is a tendency for people, if they follow this idea of equality, equal outcomes to its logical conclusion, you get to some pretty crazy or dark places. So I think that would be a useful book by Ellis, The Dark Side of the Left. It's not easy to find, but I think that's a good book. Another one, again, going back further time, Daniel Bell's book, Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. And that's less about the kind of progressivism, but more about this desire to deconstruct boundaries and to always be different in view, and that seizes hold in the arts as early as 1900, for example. It's a long-term cultural development in the West. I think it's important for people to understand that longer term, that we're living at the peak of a series of ideological processes that are quite old, actually. So this idea of sort of being anti-tradition, anti-bourgeois, I mean, that goes back well over 100 years. It's been steadily gaining power in the institutions, and now it's reached a sort of almost a fever pitch. So I think those are just a couple of books I'd recommend to get to some of the historical roots of what we're living.
Awesome. Well, Eric Kaufmann, thank you very much for joining this show. Thank you for a very thoughtful and very controversial discussion on gender, sexuality, politics, and the like.
Thanks for having me, Chung.
Yeah, I wish you all the best in your work, and do take care of yourself. Stay hydrated, stay cool, and all that in between.
Okay. Thanks very much.